Something changes in a man's 40s. The days stop feeling long. The years start feeling short. And somewhere between the obligations that never end and the milestones that were supposed to mean more, a quiet question surfaces, one that most people are afraid to say out loud. Was this it? I have spent years reading what people wrote when they understood, finally, that the time for changing course was narrowing. Letters from the 17th century, diaries from men who watched empires collapse and rebuilt their lives from rubble, testimonies recorded by physicians and confessors across 600 years of European history. And in all of that, 6 things emerge with such consistency that I have stopped calling them insights. I call them the archive, the record that every generation writes and every generation ignores. Not because the lessons are hidden. They have always been available in every serious library in the world, in every honest conversation between old men at the end of their lives. The problem is not access. The problem is timing. Each of these 6 truths has a moment in a human life when it tends to arrive. And the tragedy, the archive shows this again and again, is never the truth itself. The tragedy is always the timing. What I find remarkable, having spent years in this material, is how predictable the pattern is. A man reads these ideas at 30. He nods. He finds them reasonable. He moves on. The same man reads them at 53, and something breaks open in him. Not because the words changed, because he did. Because he now carries enough consequence in his body to feel what the words actually mean, rather than simply process them as information. Today I am going to tell you all 6, not to alarm you, but because the truth, received early, is the only real gift one person can give another. One small note before we continue. I am not offering a program, a system, or a promise. I am an archivist. What I share here is what the record consistently shows, across centuries, across cultures, across radically different social conditions. Take it as the observation of someone who has spent too many years reading what people wish they had understood sooner. Truth 1. No one is coming to save you. The year is 1453. The walls of Constantinople, which have protected the city for over 1,000 years, are beginning to fail. Inside, the Emperor Constantine XI has done something that every rational person does in a crisis. He has written letters. He has sent messengers to Rome, to Venice, to Genoa, to every king in the Christian West. He has described the situation with accuracy and urgency. He has asked for help. The help never came. Not because the people of the West were cruel, not because they failed to understand what was at stake, but because they had their own calculations, their own delays, their own reasons to wait for better information before committing to action. Venice was negotiating trade terms. Rome was divided on theology. The kings of the West were managing their own succession crises and border disputes. Everyone had a reason to wait just a little longer. The city fell on the 29th of May, and what the historians note, reading the accounts from those final weeks, is that the people inside Constantinople believed, right until the end, that someone would arrive, that the situation was too serious to be ignored, that surely someone with more power, more resources, more authority would step in and resolve it. That belief, more than any military failure, is what I want you to sit with, because this is not a story about the 15th century. It is a story about you at 38, waiting for your contribution to be recognized. About you at 45, waiting for the marriage to repair itself without a direct conversation. About you at 52, waiting for the right conditions, the right moment, the right permission to begin the thing you have been postponing for 11 years. No one is coming. I do not say this as a provocation. The archive is simply emphatic on this point. Across every era I have studied, the people who built lives of genuine depth shared one understanding, and they arrived at it earlier than most. They understood that waiting for external rescue was not patience. It was surrender in a respectable costume. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius, around 65 years after the birth of Christ, "While we are postponing, life speeds by." He was not writing about ambition. He was writing about the human habit of waiting for conditions that will never be exactly right, for people who will never arrive on schedule, for permission that will never formally be granted. What is worth understanding is that the waiting is rarely conscious. It does not feel like surrender. It feels like prudence, like responsibility, like being a reasonable person who does not act on incomplete information. The archive, however, judges by outcomes rather than intentions, and the outcomes, consistently, belong to those who moved. The first truth, then, is this: no one is coming. Not because they don't care, but because they are managing their own life, which is, from the inside, just as consuming and uncertain as yours. Every person who might theoretically rescue you is themselves waiting, in some version of the same posture, for someone else to arrive. The sooner a person receives this clearly, the more time remains to act on it. Most people receive it in their early 50s, when the largest decisions have already been shaped by someone else's hesitation on their behalf. You are watching this, which means you still have time. That matters considerably. Truth 2. Health is the only asset you cannot replace. Let me tell you about Marcus Licinius Crassus. You may know him as one of the wealthiest men in the ancient Roman world. At the peak of his fortune, around 55 before the Common Era, Crassus controlled resources equivalent to roughly 1/3 of Rome's entire annual treasury. He owned silver mines. He owned entire city blocks, which he would buy cheaply while they were burning and rent back profitably once rebuilt. He owned armies. He died, by most accounts, between the ages of 60 and 62. On a campaign into Parthia he had no strategic reason to pursue, in physical condition that the later sources describe as declining well before the final disaster. His money survived him. His influence did not. And the asset he had most systematically neglected, his body, determined the exact length of time he had available to use everything else. I have found this pattern in the archive with a frequency that stopped surprising me long ago. The Tudor merchant who built a trading operation across 4 countries but could not manage it past 54. The Baroque-era composer whose correspondence, in the final years, is filled with descriptions of a body no longer cooperating with the work he still had to do. The 19th century industrialist who accumulated enough to retire at 41, but whose cardiovascular health made the retirement a prolonged form of decline. In every case, the same asymmetry. The money lasted longer than the man. And here is what the medical research now confirms with a precision that history could only suggest. The decisions that determine your physical condition at 60, 70, and 80 are made primarily between the ages of 35 and 55. Not before, not after. That window, what you do in those 20 years, to your weight, your cardiovascular system, your relationship with sleep, your stress load, your consumption habits, those decisions compound, precisely as financial decisions compound, but with one critical difference. Financial losses can, in some circumstances, be recovered. Physical losses, past certain thresholds, cannot. The man who at 49 spends a decade in chronic sleep deprivation, elevated cortisol, and sedentary routine does not recover those years. He spends the next 2 decades managing consequences he could have avoided. There is also something the archive reveals that medicine is only beginning to quantify: the quality of your cognitive function, your clarity, your capacity for judgment, the very tool you rely on to navigate every other domain of your life, degrades in direct proportion to how poorly the body beneath it is maintained. The men in the historical record who made their worst decisions, their most consequential errors of judgment, did so overwhelmingly in periods of physical neglect. The general who miscalculated his supply lines during a prolonged campaign. The merchant who signed contracts he never would have accepted in better health. The statesman who chose confrontation over negotiation during a year the diaries describe as one of severe physical exhaustion. You cannot separate the quality of your thinking from the condition of your body. The archive does not allow that separation. I want to be specific here, because vague warnings produce only anxiety. What the archive is teaching is not take care of yourself. That is too general to be useful. What the archive is teaching is this: health is not a background condition. It is not the thing you will attend to after you have handled everything else, after the project is finished, after the children are older, after the next quarter is done. It is the foundational resource on which everything else depends. Without it, the money is a number. The achievements are hollow in ways that are genuinely difficult to articulate until you feel them from the inside. Every other asset in your life is renewable in some form, under some conditions. Your body, past certain points, is not. This is the truth that most men receive at 56. The archive suggests it is considerably more useful at 42. Truth 3. Time is accelerating, and you are not imagining it. There is a phenomenon that psychologists call the telescoping effect. In childhood, a single summer feels like a year. In middle age, a year feels like a month. By 60, an entire decade can pass with the subjective weight of what a single season once felt like. The research behind this is not speculative. It is well documented and consistent across cultures. The human brain encodes time through novel experience. Each genuinely new event creates a distinct memory, and memories are what create our felt sense of duration. When life becomes routine, when the weeks resemble each other too closely, the brain stops encoding at full resolution. Years begin to compress, not slowly, quickly. Seneca understood this without the benefit of modern neuroscience. He wrote, in the final decade of his life, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it." What he meant, and what the archive confirms repeatedly, is this: most people do not run out of time. They run out of attention. Think about the last 2 years of your life. How much of it do you remember in distinct, vivid detail? For most people past 40, the honest answer is surprisingly little. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was similar to what came before it. And similar days do not create the kind of memories that make time feel substantial. Historians sometimes call this the blank years, periods in a life that are fully documented, bills paid, meetings attended, children driven to appointments, and yet essentially invisible to the person who lived through them. When you interview people about these periods later, they describe them not with a sense of richness, but with a kind of bewildered blankness. The time passed, they say. I don't know quite where it went. I know exactly where it went. It was not encoded. The brain, which is an extraordinarily efficient machine, learned to run those years on a kind of automatic compression. Nothing required its full attention, and so it did not give its full attention, and those years left almost no trace. This is the mechanism behind the feeling, common in the mid-40s, that everything is accelerating beyond your control. It is not accelerating more than it always has. You are simply not giving it enough novelty to encode properly. The practical implication, and I want to be concrete here, is this: the richness of your experienced life, how long it feels in retrospect, how much you feel you have actually inhabited it, is determined almost entirely by the depth and variety of your attention. People who learn things that are new to them, who enter rooms they have never been in before, who hold conversations that genuinely surprise them, who take on work that requires skills they do not yet have. Those people encode more. Their years feel longer, not because they work harder, because they keep the film running at full resolution. The archive is full of men who understood this and acted on it deliberately. A Venetian diplomat in his 52nd year, who began studying Arabic, not for commerce, but because the unfamiliar kept the mind properly alive. A Scottish physician of the early 1800s, who, after 20 years of routine practice, began composing music he had never been trained for. He described the final decade of his life, in a letter to his son, as more fully inhabited than the 2 decades that preceded it combined. The third truth is this: time does not slow down, but your relationship with time can be deliberately changed, and the moment to change it is not retirement. It is not when things calm down. The moment is always, only, now. Most people receive this truth in their mid-50s, when the compression has already consumed the years they most wish they had back. I am telling you this now, at whatever age you are watching, because now is still early enough to do something with it. Truth 4. The compound effect of your daily choices is already deciding your future, right now, today. There is a letter I have returned to many times. It was written by a man I will call Thomas in the early 1700s in the American colonies. He was, by his own account, a man of genuine intelligence and considerable ambition. He had intended to start a business. He had intended to record the ideas that he believed were valuable. He had intended, for many years, to build the kind of life his capabilities warranted. He was writing this letter at 58 years old. to his younger brother. In it, he describes, with a clarity that I find almost painful to read, the distance between what he had meant to do and what he had actually done, not because of obstacles imposed from outside, but because, he writes, I found it easier, on any given day, to attend to the urgent thing and postpone the important one. 12 words, 500 pages of philosophy, compressed into 12 words. The urgent thing versus the important thing. What Thomas could not see, in the middle of his life, was that each day he made that choice, he was not simply postponing a task. He was writing a line of code into the program of who he was becoming. He was teaching himself, through repetition, that the important thing waits, that it can always wait, that it will still be there tomorrow. And it was still there, at 58, exactly where he had left it. The archive does not contain what people intended to do. It contains what they did. And the patterns across millions of those recorded lives reveal something that every honest person recognizes in themselves when they look carefully enough. You are not the person you plan to be on your best day. You are the person you are on your average day. The accumulation of average days is your life. This is a difficult truth to receive, not because it is surprising, but because most of us maintain, quietly, the belief that who we really are is our highest aspiration, our finest intention, our most expanded self-image. The record says otherwise. Your life is the compound product of what you chose to do when it was inconvenient, when you were tired, when no one was observing, when it would have been easier and more comfortable to stop. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private meditations around the year 162, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." But he wrote this not as a declaration of triumph. He wrote it as a daily reminder to himself that the discipline of consistent choice was something that required active, repeated maintenance. The Emperor of Rome needed the reminder every morning. What strikes me, reading those meditations, is that they were never intended for publication. They were written to himself, privately, a man at the peak of human power, reminding himself, daily, that the real work was not the governance of an empire. The real work was the governance of a single mind, on a single morning, making a single choice. That is where history is made, not in the grand moments that end up in books, in the ordinary moments that determine who you are when the grand moments arrive. Benjamin Franklin understood this same mechanism, though he expressed it differently. He kept a small notebook in which he tracked 13 virtues he wished to embody, not as aspirations, but as daily practice. He was not tracking whether he had good intentions. He was tracking behavior, because he understood, with the precision of a man who studied practical systems, that intentions without a record are indistinguishable from no intentions at all. The fourth truth is this: the gap between who you are and who you intend to be is not closed by wanting more intensely. It is closed by choosing differently in the small moments that feel too ordinary to count. They are not too ordinary. They are, in fact, the only moments that count, because they are the only moments that are real. Truth 5. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding the one decision that would change everything. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable entry in the archive, because it requires a degree of honesty that most people are willing to approach only very briefly, before finding a good reason to look somewhere else. Here is what I mean. In the diaries and correspondence of people who lived through genuine inflection points, whether economic, political, or personal, there is a recurring figure. I encounter this figure across almost every century I have studied. He is intelligent, he is aware, he understands his situation with considerable clarity. He can describe in articulate detail what would need to change for his life to be different. And then he does not change it. The reasons vary. The times are uncertain. The conditions are not quite right. The family cannot absorb the disruption. The financial situation requires stability first. Next year will be better. The year after that. What makes this figure so recognizable and so uncomfortable is this. He is not confused about what the decision is. He knows exactly what it is. He simply finds, reliably, that the cost of making it is slightly higher than the cost of postponing it. For 1 year, and then another, and then another. The Venetian merchants of the late 15th century, who watched the trade routes shifting east, who understood what it meant, who had the capital to respond, but waited for confirmation that never came in the form they expected. By the time confirmation arrived, the window had closed. The merchants who moved early, who accepted the discomfort of uncertainty before it became the certainty of loss, built the next generation of their family's wealth. The ones who waited managed a graceful decline. The British industrialists of the 1880s, who could see the patterns in American and German competition, who had the means to adapt, and chose instead to optimize the existing system until the system was no longer viable. The pattern is not about intelligence. The people in these records are often remarkably intelligent. The pattern is about the human tendency to prefer the certain discomfort of the present over the uncertain discomfort of change. There is a mechanism behind this that the archive illustrates vividly, though it took the behavioral sciences several centuries to name it precisely. The pain of a potential loss feels, in the moment of decision, larger than the pain of continued stagnation, even when, rationally, the math runs in the opposite direction. The mind has evolved to protect against immediate threats, not long-term erosions. And so it experiences the act of choosing as a threat, and the act of waiting as relief. The relief is real, and it is temporary. And the next morning, the situation that required a decision is still there, slightly less favorable than it was the day before. And the most precise thing the archive can tell you about this tendency is the following. The cost of the decision does not decrease with time. It increases, because the conditions that made the decision necessary do not wait for you to feel ready. They continue developing, whether or not you are moving. The fifth truth is this. You almost certainly know what the one significant decision in your current life is, the one you have been approaching and retreating from. The archive suggests strongly that the cost of making it now is lower than the cost of making it 3 years from now, and it will be lower again than the cost of arriving at it through necessity rather than through choice. History tends to be most merciful to the people who chose before they were forced to. Truth 6. You will regret what you did not do far more than what you did. In 1989, two American researchers studied the structure of human regret across different age groups. They wanted to understand not just what people regretted, but how the nature of regret changed as people grew older. What they found has been replicated many times across different cultures and different countries, and the pattern is consistent. In the short term, people primarily regret actions: the business venture that did not succeed, the investment that failed, the conversation that went badly. These regrets are real and present. But over time, action-based regrets fade. What remains and what grows are the regrets of inaction, the path not taken, the creative work that stayed in a drawer, the relationship not pursued, the conversation that should have happened and did not. By middle age, regrets of inaction significantly outnumber regrets of action. By old age, the proportion is not close. Research suggests that in the final decades of life, regrets of inaction outnumber regrets of action by a ratio of roughly 2 to 1. That number is probably conservative, because people are often reluctant to admit the full weight of what they did not attempt. The archive says exactly the same thing, centuries before the researchers quantified it. Read the letters of people who knew they were near the end. Read the diaries of men and women reviewing their lives in their final decade. The pain they describe is almost never about the risks that failed. It is about the risks they did not take. The business they did not start because the timing was not perfect. The country they did not move to because it seemed impractical. The person they did not speak honestly to because the moment passed before they found the words. The version of themselves they kept meaning to become once things settled down. Things do not settle down. This is one of history's most consistent observations. The conditions for the important decision are never perfect. They are sometimes acceptable. And acceptable, the archive suggests, is the only invitation that most meaningful things ever offer. I want to be precise here, because this truth is easily misread as an argument for recklessness. The archive does not romanticize recklessness. Empires were lost to it. Fortunes, health, families, all were destroyed by impulsive action mistaken for courage. The distinction the record makes is between fear-based inaction and reasoned caution. From the outside, they look identical. From the inside, the person always knows which one they are operating from. Fear says, wait until it is safe. Reasoned caution says, here are the specific conditions under which I will proceed. One is a posture, the other is a plan. And there is one further observation from the archive that I find particularly arresting. The people who attempted and failed did not, as a rule, regret the attempt. What they regretted, if anything, was not attempting sooner. Even failure, properly metabolized, tends to produce something: a clearer understanding, a recalibration, a lesson that becomes the foundation of the next attempt. There is a letter from a Flemish merchant of the early 1600s who had launched 3 separate trading ventures, each of which collapsed for reasons largely outside his control: war, plague, the unpredictability of weather, and politics. He died, by all accounts, in modest circumstances. But his letters in his final years describe not bitterness, but something considerably more surprising: satisfaction, not in the outcomes, but in the fullness of the attempt. He wrote, near the end, "A man who tries and loses has at least spent his years in motion. Inaction produces nothing except a widening distance between who you are and who you might have been." The sixth truth is this: the version of your life you are afraid to reach for is more likely to haunt you than any genuine attempt to reach for it. History has always known this. You are simply receiving it at a moment when it may still be genuinely useful. 6 truths, all of them available to anyone who reads history carefully. All of them, somehow, still being discovered for the first time by men and women in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s. Why? I have thought about this for a long time. The answer I keep returning to is not complicated. These truths are not hidden. The problem is that when we are young, we believe that understanding a truth is the same thing as absorbing it. It is not. Absorption requires something that youth, by definition, has not yet accumulated enough of: consequence. A child can read about fire and understand, in full intellectual clarity, that fire burns. But they still need to get close enough to feel the heat before the understanding becomes truly operative, truly theirs. For most of us, the heat of these 6 truths arrives only when we are close enough to consequence that the lessons take on real urgency, when the health is already compromised, when the decision has already been made by default, when the years have already compressed beyond what seemed possible. My purpose here is to be the library that finds you a little before the consequence does. There's also something else worth saying. The people in the archive who received these truths early and acted on them did not lead lives of grim determination. They did not sacrifice the present for some abstract future. What the record shows, with a consistency I find quietly moving, is that the people who understood early that no one was coming, that health was irreplaceable, that time was not infinite, those people did not become anxious or bitter. They became, in the truest sense of the word, awake. They were present in a way that people who believe time is unlimited rarely are. They made the phone call. They had the conversation. They started the work. Not because they were afraid of regret, but because they understood, clearly and early, that this was the only life available to them. Not a rehearsal, not a draft, the actual thing. The archive does not speak to alarm, and it does not speak to motivate in the shallow sense of that word. It speaks because the record exists, the patterns are visible, and they are visible to anyone willing to read them with honest attention. For the person watching this, the archive suggests that the best time to understand these 6 things was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Tell me in the comments, which of these 6 truths arrived for you most recently? And which one do you wish you had understood a decade earlier? I read every response, and the answers I find often teach me as much as the archive does.